Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 152. Today's guest is Rachel Lyon. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today, I'm pleased to welcome writer Rachel Lyon back to the show for a conversation about her latest novel, Fruit of the Dead. Rachel Lyon is the author of Self-Portrait with Boy, which was a finalist for the Center for Fiction's 2018 First Novel Prize, and Fruit of the Dead, which was named a most anticipated book of 2024 by Elle, Oprah Daily, People, and other outlets, and chosen for discussion by New England Public Media's book club. Rachel's short work has appeared in publications such as One Story, The Rumpus, and Electric Literature. A teacher of creative writing at various institutions, most recently Bennington College, she lives with her husband and two young children in Western Massachusetts, where she co-hosts the Dream Away reading series. Rachel has been appointed the 2024 Paris Writer-in-Residence by the Paris School of Arts and Culture, the American University of Paris, and the Centre Culturel Irlandais. Longtime listeners may recall that Rachel was first on the show back in 2019 to talk about her debut novel, Self-Portrait with Boy. At that point, she was already working on the manuscript for what would become this new novel, Fruit of the Dead, which she even mentioned briefly in our conversation. This new novel is a contemporary retelling of the Persephone myth, in which a young woman, Cory, is hired to be the nanny for the young children of this incredibly wealthy man named Rollo and brought to his private island. And what follows is, like the original myth, a story with a lot of darkness to it. It's a story about addiction and class and sex and sexual assault. It's about power and who has it, about selfhood and coming of age, about family and independence. I thought it was a really compelling and frankly chilling read, and I'm really happy I got the chance to talk to Rachel about it. There are links in the show notes to purchase your own copies of Fruit of the Dead from Broadside Bookshop in Northampton, Massachusetts, from the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and from bookshop.org. But as always, if there is an independent bookstore in your community, I highly recommend supporting your local book business and ordering from there. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Rachel Lyon. You know, you had been on the show, I think it was 5 years ago at this point, to talk about your first book, Self-Portrait with Boy. And I had actually just been back to re-listen to that conversation to sort of think about what we had talked about then and what I might like to talk about now. First thing is, I wanted to just say I really, really enjoyed Fruit of the Dead quite a lot. I think I may have seen you say, maybe it was in your newsletter, that you think this is the best thing you've ever written. And I think it might be. It's, I've read, I read your first book. I've read several of your short stories. And I always enjoy your work, but I feel like this is really kind of next level. So
thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. I wanted to make sure I said that first thing. And I actually had just mentioned this in the pre-show, but the first time you were on Keep the Channel Open, for the second segment, we had talked about alcoholism. And at that point, you'd been sober for about a year. And we talked a lot about the changes that it had brought into your life and the role of alcohol in our culture, particularly for women. And one of the things we talked about at that time was sort of the way that alcohol acts as a replacement for ritual in our culture, or how its use in our culture is sort of ritualized, and how a lack of ritual in our culture is difficult for people, how it's hard to have enough sense of self in our culture without these sort of cultural apparatus to hang our sense of self on. And I feel like that sense of self is something that's particularly malleable and fragile during adolescence and young adulthood. And it's something that I feel plays a lot into the character of Cory, into what she is like, her personality, what motivates her, and especially into the way that she thinks about herself in relation to other people, which I feel like is kind of a big part of the plot of this story as well. But I wanted to sort of see how that sounded to you and whether that sparked anything for you.
Yeah. Thank you for starting there. I really appreciate that observation. And it's definitely something I was thinking of really intentionally when I was writing the book. You know, I'm 41 and I feel like my sense of self is still pretty plastic and flexible. Certainly it's gotten firmer with age, but at 18, like Cory, I had really no idea who I was. And I think I was really drawing on that, you know, writing her. I remember at an early workshop on the book with my writing group, my then writing group, someone, I think a man in the group noticed that, you know, there are times when Cory seems quite confident, even arrogant, playful, flirtatious, extroverted. And then there are times when she seems like devastatingly self-conscious, like her ego is sort of in the toilet and she doesn't know who she is at all. And this reader pointed that out as an inconsistency, which I thought was really interesting. When I did not change it, and you know, it was intentional. And when I brought it to my editor at Scribner, that was one of the things she responded to in a really positive way about the book. You know, that shifting sense of self felt really authentic to her in terms of this character, this 18-year-old, just 18-year-old who really doesn't quite know how to see herself in the world. You know, she feels she knows certain things about her appearance, that she's tall and thin and, you know, but even that can be flipped inside out and turned into a negative, that she's gawky and lanky and awkward and, you know, her nose is too big and her hair is uncool, and yet she has moments of like incredible brazenness too. You know, she's testing things out. She's trying different versions of herself out. And I think landing on Rolo's Island is kind of the perfect opportunity for her to really try out a new persona, which she does to mixed results.
Mixed results. That's a way of putting it.
Yeah.
That's a really fascinating comment to me. I felt like, you know, obviously I noticed that as well, that sort of shift in how she thinks about herself. And even sometimes that happens in the moment, you know, like one point that really stands out to me is sort of the last interaction she has with Cricket, the mother of the kids that she is ostensibly the nanny for, and how, you know, I don't want to give anything away about the story. I don't know if spoilers necessarily make sense in the context of a story based on a myth that kind of everybody knows, but
right.
But, you know, I don't want to like give too much away, right? But, you know, this interaction where she sort of says a thing and then immediately sees that she's overplayed her position, that felt, like your editor said, so authentic to me. And I can remember feeling that way very clearly as a young person. It's interesting to me that this other guy that you showed the work to had that as sort of a negative thing. And it kind of makes me think of there being this way in which I feel like for a lot of people, we have a tendency of kind of forgetting what it was like to be young, forgetting what it was like to not be the person we are now. And I feel like there is maybe something to that in the relationship between Cory and her mother. Is it pronounced Emer?
Emer.
Emer. Okay. So
yeah,
between Emer and Cory, there is this very, again, authentic feeling relationship between them, part of which has to do with, I think, the way that they do and don't see each other. It's interesting. You've mentioned in a few different interviews that having Emer's perspective in the story, that she gives you this sort of outside perspective on Cory, and that you need that because you need to have somebody in the story that sees Cory clearly because of the fact that Cory doesn't see herself clearly. But for me, and, you know, this is something that comes up for me a lot, not just as a reader, but as both a parent of adolescent children and as someone who was an adolescent child at some point, the ways in which parents and children both do and don't know each other in really profound ways, both of those things. And I kind of feel like that's sort of one of the central tensions in that relationship, not just, in both art and real life. The way that nobody really sees each other clearly, or even themselves clearly. I mean, there's something that you kind of touched on just a minute ago, saying like, even at 41, you don't feel like you fully know yourself. Maybe you know yourself better than you used to. You have a more solid sense of self now than you did at 18. But I mean, is that something that we ever get to, that sort of tension between they know each other really well and they don't know each other at all, I feel like is, again, something that really motivates a lot of, particularly the backstory of this novel. But how does that strike you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Emer's constantly saying things to the reader like, look at her, she's so beautiful, like, look at my daughter, leggy love child of the fairy queen and Ziggy Stardust. Like, she's really caught up in and distracted by Cory's beauty, and even sort of admits that she has a certain amount of envy and resentment because of the not necessarily because Cory is more beautiful than she is, although that's part of it, but also because she can see very clearly, more clearly than Cory can, how vulnerable that beauty has made her. And I think that really frightens her, and that's not something Cory sees about herself at all.
Yeah.
I think there's a way, and like, she's missing a kind of empathy, even though she feels for Cory very deeply. I think she has major blind spots about her daughter, and like, I think it's really like what you're saying is so interesting. Like, we see our kids first from the outside because we've known them since before they had any kind of self-awareness. We've been observing them since before they could observe themselves. Like, so my younger child, my daughter will be 2 in August, and she doesn't have any self-consciousness at all. She's just like a wrecking ball. She's like, she screams when she wants to scream, and she demands when she wants to demand. And she can also be incredibly charming, and she's really intuitive emotionally. Like, she knows how to communicate with us better than she can with words, through her like gestures and etc. But she's just learning what Sylvie means, right? Like, she's just referring to herself in the third person with her name, and like understanding where she fits in like the context of our family and the larger world, such as it is. Like, her world is still pretty small. My son is almost 4, and he's like really like pensive about this sort of thing. I can't even imagine what it'll be like when they're teenagers. I think I'm a writer who writes toward like stages that I haven't yet hit. Like, that's my inclination, I think, is to kind of write from a place of anxiety. Like, imagine what life might be like in the next stage or several stages beyond where I'm at. Anyway, I was a teenager who kept a lot of secrets and was kind of private from my own parents for various reasons. And I think that is necessarily a component to, I don't know, did I just ramble like unforgivably?
No. I mean, to me, I think that this is all really, I think that this is, well, 1, it's relevant to the book, and 2, it's just relevant to, well, at least to my life. And I think that this is something that, a lot of times I think about, why we read the things we read, why we connect with the things that we connect with in art. And lots of people are parents. And even if you don't have kids, you were a kid at one point. Even if you are not a parent, you have parents. And there's lots of different ways that can look. But there are certain things that do seem to, if not universal, there are things that lots of us have in common. And I think that this sort of tension between ourselves and our parents, and then later between ourselves and our kids, is is almost a sort of fundamental thing about the human experience. You know, my older daughter is going to be 13 in September. And, you know, we're just starting to go through the whole teenage thing. And it's just a fascinating experience being able to, I feel like, really deeply understand the sort of resentments that she feels, the way that she sees herself as an independent person who's capable of making her own decisions and should be able to make her own decisions. Because I remember feeling that way really clearly and still sometimes do. I still sometimes have the same resentments towards my parents. But at the same time, also being able to see from the outside, like, you're not as mature as you think you are. And that is not something that I would have been able to say about myself. Even if I did say that about myself when I was a teenager, but I didn't know it in the same way that I know it now. But I think that's something that plays so importantly into like why Cory does everything that she does in this book, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. When you're a teenager, I think you're defining yourself in reaction to the world, right? Like against the world. It's like against the negative space or whatever it is. I think she's not really able to say, this is who I am in a fully positive way against a blank canvas. It's more like, okay, within the context of these constraints, here's what I'm going to push against.
Yeah. It's, I know that this is something that you've talked about. I think you've talked about this in both your newsletter and in some other interviews, this question of agency for young women, and wanting to write a character where she has agency within the story, especially because that's something that's very missing from the Persephone myth, right?
Right.
And it's just, I mean, I mentioned that I have a tween daughter myself, and that sort of push and pull that when it comes to agency in a young person is something that is frankly terrifying, just in life, right? And it's something that the end of this book was, especially the last line, is just chilling to me, at least. I mean, I don't know how it strikes other people, but this idea that, you know, she is going to go back. I mean, and that's part of the myth. So I don't feel like I'm giving anything away, that like Persephone returns to Hades for a part of every year.
Right.
But then doing that in the context of a person who's making her own choices about what to do, it is this experience that she has on the island with this Hades figure, Rollo, is simultaneously compelling and charming and seductive and utterly horrifying, right? And a lot of it feels very surreal. It feels like a fever dream at times. And you can kind of see why she makes the choices that she does. You can see how it does kind of make a certain internal sense, but also you kind of, or at least for me, it's like you want her not to make those decisions, even as you can kind of understand why she does. And it's, to me as a parent, that's something that, it's one of the things that is so scary about parenting, is this idea that your kids are going to make bad choices and that these are things that are going to have consequences for them. I don't know that that's necessarily a question, but it's just something that I found so compelling about this question of agency, is like, well, what happens when you, not like if, but when you use that agency to make really bad decisions, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's another way of reading that too, which I'm not sure. I don't know if it came through or not, but she's a victim, right? Like Persephone is a victim. It's called the rape of Persephone. That's what the myth is, how the myth is referred to. And she has a choice there. Like, is she going to run away from it, or is she going to use this experience in some way? And in the end, I don't know. Like, yes, there was the myth sort of predetermining how I was going to end the book. I could have chosen to ignore that, but I didn't really want to. I wanted Cory to feel empowered to leverage this experience herself. You know, she learns things about being an adult on Rolo's Island, which are not very pretty, right? Like she learns about leverage, social leverage and manipulation and power. And like, these are things that like we don't want to teach our kids because they're ugly, you know, it's an ugly part of humanity, but it's real. And my sense of her is that she's grown up in that way by the end of the book. Like she's learned something kind of naughty about adulthood that she's going to bring with her into her 20s. And, you know, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a kind of a victory for her, you know, because she starts out being a little naive. I mean, very naive. She's young, she's impulsive, imaginative, dreamy, bad in school, like all of these things that aren't going to do her any favors in adulthood, even though, you know, I find them charming, you know, character things or whatever. You know, I like all of these things about her the same way her mother does. But what makes, you know, a powerful woman, like those aren't really the things that make a powerful woman in our society. I'd like to imagine that, you know, despite everything, she's going into the rest of her life empowered.
I guess I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it makes a lot of sense as you're hearing. I guess one of the things that, because we're left at the end of the story where we don't know what's going to happen to her going forward, except in the context of, you know, understanding that this is a retelling of the Persephone myth. So she is probably going to come back, or at least she entertains the idea. But I guess that is sort of the thing about life is that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how this is all going to work out for her. But yeah, that's interesting. So I think that there's something interesting about having Cory as a narrator, as one of the narrators of this story, insofar as, you know, a lot of the story is told from her perspective in a really close third person. And, you know, sort of as we've talked about, Cory is a person who doesn't necessarily understand herself very well for the majority of the story. And she doesn't even necessarily understand the dynamics that are happening around her super well for most of the story. So we can think about her as, you know, as being an unreliable narrator. I think that what's interesting to me is, so we have 2 points of view in the story. We have Cory's point of view and Emer's point of view. And I guess there might be a question as to what degree Emer is also an unreliable narrator, but I think that's not really the way that she functions in the story. So Emer's sections are in first person and Cory's sections are in third person. And typically when I think of a story with an unreliable narrator, I'm thinking about a story that's told in the first person. You know, like classically, I'm thinking about Humbert in Lolita. And this is so something that we talked about when we were talking about Self-Portrait with Boy, because that story is told in the first person. And I would argue that Lou Ryle is also in some ways an unreliable narrator. You know, the fact that story starts with her talking about, this is how I want you to think about this story. This is what I want you to take away from this. Right. And then a whole bunch of stuff happens that leads you to question whether or not that's true. Right. That was something we talked about in our first conversation, and how the first person perspective is such a seductive perspective because it is kind of authoritative in that way. And also just in general, I'm thinking about how this book is not one that I would think of as YA, but it has some things in common with YA, just insofar as YA so often has a sort of coming of age story, which I think you could argue this is, that is centered around a young woman as the narrator. And those are almost always told in first person present tense. So this, like, whether I'm thinking about adult fiction with an unreliable narrator or YA fiction with any type of narrator, I'm used to thinking about this in terms of first person. And whereas here you're doing this in third person. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Is that okay?
Yeah. That's an interesting observation that it's a bit of an inversion of our expectations of unreliability. That hadn't actually occurred to me. I like that. I think, to give you a classic writer's response, this is just kind of the way that the book came to me. I think the character of Cory, right, she's like often playing with substances, going on flights of fancy in her mind. There are various reasons why she's unreliable, and these reasons are connected to why she's written in the third person. For Cory, I wanted a kind of a literary, almost magical voice. Like I wanted to lean into the sort of fantasy that she lives in for much of the book, and this like third person, highly descriptive, sort of lush voice felt like the one that would convey her role as like heroine of the fairy tale. With Emer, I myself had just become a mother when I started writing Emer's sections, and that was the voice that I was writing. This kind of like vexed, difficult, ambivalent, judgmental, sort of, like grown up, worried voice. I also sort of like this feeling that Emer could be, like through some reading, Emer could be telling Cory's story because she's the first person narrative voice and Cory's in the third. It like sort of implies a connection there, which I just liked sort of like leaving that there.
It's an interesting idea. It's not one that had occurred to me. There's obviously like a lot of Cory's internal state that is so much a part of the prose in Cory's sections that these are things that are going to be inaccessible to Emer, and in a way that I think is really important to the story. But it's an interesting thing. One of the things that I was thinking about is the way that the sort of narrative perspective can, like, what makes something authoritative or not, what makes you identify with a character more or less. Like for me, as because I am, a middle-aged parent of teenage children now, like you would think that I would identify more with Emer's perspective. And there are ways in which I definitely do. But I think there's something about the perspective that, at least for me, oftentimes when I'm reading first person, it creates more of an awareness that it's a person separate from me talking to me, as opposed to when I'm reading in third person, but especially in a close third person, the sort of authorial voice disappears a little bit more, and it makes me feel closer to that character.
Yeah.
While at the same time, I feel like the third person can also create a certain distance as well, because it's not necessarily clear who's talking exactly. It's not exactly God that's talking, but it's also not exactly the person that's talking. So I don't know. It's an interesting sort of like, I'm going to use that word tension over and over again, I guess, but
yeah,
you know what I mean?
I really do. I love that flexibility of the third person, that it can weave in and out of the experience of the character so easily. There are times when, what's that called? Free indirect discourse, when it sort of moves from just outside a character's experience into that character's head and then back out again. It's very, fun. It's fun to play with. And I remember being like a little kid and who read a lot of books and like sort of narrating my experience in that way. Like distinctly, I remember like being at the beach as the sun was going down, like over a summer break with my parents, and Like she climbed slowly up the dune as the sun set, over the, like I just had that like sort of pick, as a little kid. And I wanted to bring that to Cory, because I do think it's sort of like telling of her imaginative impulses and her decadence, her love of the world and like beauty and her place in it. That she can inhabit her own third person narrative voice.
Mm. So we're getting close to time for this section, but there's a big thing here that I wanted to talk about that I feel like is really important to the story. And I think it touches on something that you'd mentioned a bit ago, this thing about maybe what lessons Cory has learned about life or about other people, about adulthood, because I think that there's something about both the sort of upper class, like super rich lifestyle, and about Rollo in particular, that has this really fantastic quality to it. This, and you said this just now too, like about wanting to give this sense of the fantastic to the prose, but at the same time, you're also constantly having it pointed out to you in the ways that Cory is seeing, both the ways that this is a seductive figure, a seductive lifestyle, a seductive world that's very charming and charismatic, at the same time as seeing the ways, the sort of underbelly of it and the ways that it is kind of repellent. And I feel like this operates on a lot of level, like on sort of like a class level of like, wealth being aspirational, but also being seedy, and also that it doesn't actually elevate anybody, that people are still people with the same sort of base motivations, even if they are beautiful and have a beautiful life. And then on a personal level, this question of whether Rollo is written as a villain or not. Like, I think that in the course of the story, he is villainous. Like, I think that he's written in this way where, you can't not be aware of, like, the book doesn't let him off the hook, right? Like, you're very aware of the fact that he's controlling and the fact that he's like coercing her, but he's coercing her in a way that she doesn't necessarily understand most of the time is coercive. But you also give him a lot more of a rounded character with a lot more charisma, and I don't know if empathy is quite the right word, but like you give the reader the opportunity to understand what motivates this man in a way that like a pure villain isn't. And that's really interesting to me. But even more interesting to me than that, and perhaps in some ways more relevant to the question of what Cory learns, like I'm thinking about not just Rollo, but the staff, like, and particularly Virgil, right? Like who these people aren't doing the things that Rollo does. Like Virgil doesn't, like he's not the one committing a rape, right? But he's also not doing anything to stop it from happening. And moreover, it becomes clear through the course of the book that like he understands exactly what's happening, and he always has understood what's happening. And, he's sort of a cipher for most of the book. Towards the end, you get a little, like, it's like a page and a half where you get a bit of his backstory that really reveals how clear-eyed he is about everything that he's doing. And in that way, like you're at least for me, like he comes off almost more villainous than the actual villain does. And I think that I'm not sure whether or not that's something that Cory fully takes in, but you got to figure that even if she doesn't right now, she will, right? But this thing about all of these things, seeing both the aspiration and the attraction of it, and also seeing the sort of grossness of it, is such a key part of the experience of reading this book. So can we talk about that?
Yeah. So there's that, the banality of evil, the Hannah Arendt idea, and then the sort of like I didn't want any of these characters to be flat, and didn't feel that the plot would work if anyone were just a flat antagonist or a flat villain. I also didn't. I'm just not interested in villains in that way. Like I came to the project initially from, the Me Too movement and this dialogue that's like totally difficult dialogue between victims and perpetrators where like, no one who commits very few people, I think, who commit a rape think that they're rapists, like men who have like committed acts of sexual violence aren't going around being like, I'm a guy who commits acts of sexual violence. We have narratives about ourselves, and those narratives, by and large, I think paint us in more positive lights than other people might. And I was just really interested in like what a guy like Rollo thinks about himself, how he positions himself in the world. And, he's not just a guy who has a certain amount of entitlement, although he is that. He's also kind of a self-made man and kind of he has a weakness for a certain kind of youth and beauty and innocence, which he feels makes him a sensitive guy, and he is a sensitive guy, but he's also a brute. He's like all of the things, and I think I was really curious about Virgil and like how, in my research for the book, I watched the Jeffrey Epstein docuseries, which I can't recommend to anyone. It's really awful. Mm-hmm. Not poorly made, just like hard to watch,
Yeah.
And what I walked away from there were many people on Jeffrey Epstein's island who knew exactly what was going on and didn't feel like they were in a position to do anything about it. A few of them were really disturbed, but they kept their mouths shut. And that's part of how this sort of thing happens, right? Like there's the guy who's committing the act, but then there's like this huge cast of characters around him who are looking the other way or helping in some subtle way or whatever it may be. So I didn't want, I also don't think of Virgil as a villain or an antagonist either. I think, many times over the course of the book, he says to Cory some version of, you're not trapped here. You can leave anytime, just say the word, I think he sees for her, what he sees is that she's complicit in her own, anything that's happening to her, she's pretty complicit. And she is, like she's not struggling to leave the island. She chooses to stay to her own detriment. And I think that's, I think that's understandable from where she's at. I think, I've definitely seen some readers respond to the book being like, this main character is kind of an idiot or whatever, like.
Yeah, but aren't we all?
Yeah, exactly. Like I was an idiot too. He who was not a teenage idiot cast the first stone, right? I think Virgil is giving her more bandwidth than she actually can use, right? Or he's assuming that she'll make the decision that's right for her when that's not quite accurate.
Yeah. It's also a way, I feel like, of like reducing his own sense of his own complicity. He's like, well, I gave you the chance and you didn't take it.
Yes, exactly. And he has his own reasons for like he makes great money doing this job. And that was unexpected for him. And like, he's doing well. And this guy has been his mentor, for better and for worse. And I just wanted to give each of these characters the ability to see themselves in a way that maybe we don't see them. Because to me, that's the most important and interesting thing you can do in fiction is like outline the contours of this gap between self-perception and one's perception by the world around one.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Like we all have that, right? We all have some idea of who we are and how we appear. And then the rest of the world brings their ideas of who we are and how we appear. And like, whatever, I'm just really like endlessly curious about the gap between those two perspectives.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways that is sort of one of the fundamental things about the human experience is that gap. And it's one that, like for ourselves in our real lives, we never actually can fully bridge that gap. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we could try.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we take a quick little break and then come back and do the second segment?
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
You know what? Now that we're here, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm kind of curious about this idea of stages of life. You know, we've talked about the ways that parents can both be and not be their children. And we've been talking about Cory and Emer and as like characters of different generations. I'm now working on my third book, which is about a friendship that lasts many years, and it's told in reverse chronological order. So it starts when one of the friends has died and the other is 52, and then moves backwards in time by 6-year increments until the characters meet at the age of 10. So I've been thinking a lot about age, age in fiction and age in life as I enter middle age and my children move from babyhood into toddlerhood and then young kidhood. You know, I'm thinking a lot about how to write characters of different age and how to relate to people of different age and how to be a new age myself, you know, and so that's my topic.
Yeah. It's such a strange thing to compare the difference in how things look from the outside than how they feel from the inside. You know, especially when we're parents, we can see so starkly the difference in our children as they get older. I mean, it does sneak up on you, but it's also just wildly apparent even as it's happening. Whereas from the inside, I mean, I often think about this thing that my mom told me when I was probably in my late 20s. So she would have been in her 50s at the time, and my grandmother would have been, you know, in her 70s or early 80s at the time. And she was telling me about how she had talked recently with her own mom. And I don't know exactly what brought up the topic, but that even she at that age was saying that you never fully really feel like you're older than a kid. Like you still feel the same, you know, you still kind of feel like a 15-year-old kid, even when you're 80. And I think that is such an interesting thing that difference between how you think about yourself and how you think about other people is so different, but also that, like, if I'm really being honest with myself, if I think about the way that I feel now, like I will often feel like I'm not that different of a person now than I was when I was in high school. But that if I'm really thinking about it hard, like I actually am pretty different, even though I don't feel different, you know, like the way that I feel about things is pretty different now. And the way that I think about things is pretty different, even though it feels like there's a continuity. I don't know if that's really a response to what you were saying.
My dad has this idea that everyone has like their ideal age that they spend their life approaching and then receding from. And my parents agree that my mom's ideal age is 11. Like she's just going to be 11 forever spiritually. I'm not sure what his is, but I asked him once what mine was. And I think he said 40, which is like pretty much my age now. Like I'm 41 now, and I feel like he's right. I actually feel like I'm probably more myself now than I ever have been. Hopefully that just continues to be true though. Like I would hate to feel like the rest of my life is just like leaving my ideal age
Yeah.
in the rearview mirror.
I think for me, people have been saying that I'm like an old man since I was like 4. So for me, it's probably like 75 or something. I don't know.
You're going to reach 75 and you could be like, I've arrived.
Yeah.
Here I am. Yeah.
It is such an interesting thing. Like, I'm thinking about books about different times of life. And one thing that is, I think we culturally have this sort of fascination with the coming of age story. Like, I was just talking to my kids about this the other day, how I was recommending some book or something to one of my kids. We were driving somewhere and talking about how it was a coming of age story. And I was saying how, you would think that by the time you get to be my age, I just turned 45, that these stories about young people coming of age would stop being so compelling, but they really don't stop being compelling. Like there is something that remains really fascinating about that moment of life. And of course, there are all different ways that a coming of age story can look, and it's not specific to one particular year in your life. But something that I think a lot about is, and in particular, this is something that plays out for me a lot via social media, is that really doesn't stop happening. Like we sort of, when we talk about developmental stages, I think a lot of times we're thinking about, toddlers and childhood and maybe adolescence. But like, I kind of feel like there is a developmental stage that we all just keep going through, and that like a lot of the things that I'm coming to understand about sort of younger middle adulthood and older adulthood, even having that lens of developmental stages is actually really useful.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've really appreciated in like recent internet discourse is the idea of matrescence, how a mother's brain changes in pregnancy and early parenthood as drastically. It looks like neurologically, the change apparently is as dramatic as adolescence. I love this idea, and that feels accurate to my experience, that like parenthood would be this profound rewiring of the brain that parallels the rewiring that happens when you're a kid, and so why not have coming of age stories about coming of middle age, or coming of age as a young 20 something, or coming of age as an older person, I think we come of many ages.
Yeah. You started off this saying, you mentioned the word generations, generational differences, I think. And that's something that I think about a lot too, because I feel like there is this sort of, there are certain experiences of life that feel universal. Like it is universal that all of us only go through life one time. So, everything that happens to us is new. And I feel like one of the things for me that's so interesting is, I over the past couple of years have spent a lot of time on TikTok and watching millennials, and particularly younger millennials, coming to terms with the fact that they're old now, that other people see them as old. Which my response to that is if you can be surprised that other people think you're old, you're probably not that old. But how watching collectively this group of people on, making videos or whatever, coming to that realization and thinking like, yeah, that's how I felt 10 years ago. That's really interesting. But also at the same time that like, I also feel like there is something specific about what each sort of age cohort goes through. Like we all have the same experience of like, aging and our bodies changing and things like that. But also there are things that each generation experiences that, the other previous generations didn't because they weren't alive at, at this time,
Mm-hmm.
at that age. It's something I think about a lot when people talk about Gen Z and what they're like. And I think to myself,
Mm-hmm.
well, I mean, life was pretty different for me. Like, I was growing up in a really different world when I was like 15 or 20. The world looked really
Mm-hmm.
different from how it is now. And so even though maybe my adolescent brain was developing in a similar way and there were similarities, like, it's pretty different. I feel like that sort of tension between the universal and the specific is something that is really interesting to me. And just in the context of making art, like I wonder how easy it would be to be able to step outside of that, I think it would be really hard.
Yeah. My partner and I just watched The Holdovers, that Paul Giamatti movie. Did you see that?
I don't think so.
It's really good. It's a really good screenplay, and it's really like heartwarming in a sort of a way that, I mean, it's not obnoxiously heartwarming. It's like authentically heartwarming. I thought, but one of the things that I found myself, it's set in the 70s and at like a boarding school, and there were certain things about like the set or like the cars that they used, that there was a car that they were driving, and I was like, that's my grandmother's car, or like this kitchen that they ended up in, and I was like, that's my Nana's kitchen, like there are physical spaces and materials that feel so deeply, intimately familiar to me. Like I can remember running my hand over linoleum as a kid, and like kids born today, like certainly have no idea what that felt like, or like the leather upholstery on an old Pontiac, like that's lost to history, it's so curious how like those materials, like the effect that certain sensory experiences have on us. The smell of cigarettes, that's not going to go away anytime soon. Like people will always smoke maybe, but it was much more pervasive then. It's definitely not as common. Like you don't walk into a space now, like a restaurant, and smell cigarettes, but when we were kids, that still happened. I'm not saying anything incredibly original or new. I just think a lot about like how, like how you're saying, like there are certain universals, like aging is a universal, and then there are certain incredible specifics about our particular generations. And we're of a generation that's like, the smell of cigarettes at a Friendly's and leather upholstery are going to die with us,
Yeah, that smell of cigarettes is something that I associate with my grandfather. Was like, he smoked a lot. He was just constantly smoking. And so it's something that I always associate with age, with a certain sense of comfort, with a deep voice, with an Arkansas drawl. Like that is just what comes to mind for me when I smell that smell. Beans and white bread with butter on it. I think when I'm thinking about this in terms of, because you were just talking about this new book that you're working on, which I'm certainly excited to find out how this turns out.
Me too.
The idea of coming at this from, in a reverse chronological way, I think is interesting. And there's something about watching that unfold in that direction, I think is interesting. But I think that there's something, I'm having a little trouble articulating it, that this question of, what are we like at each age? And like, to what extent do we forget? I mean, and this is related to the conversation we were having about Fruit of the Dead. Like, to what extent do we forget what it was like to be, 6 years ago, 12 years ago, 18 years ago? You know what I mean?
Right. I feel like all of that remains inside us forever, otherwise it wouldn't feel so emotionally satisfying or resonant to read like coming of age stories about teenagers when we're in our 40s. Like it's not like any of that really disappears. In fact, I think there's, like that's what makes it so satisfying to read about other people of other ages. You recognize something that you maybe forgot a little bit.
Yeah. The thing that I often think about is the way memory works. And I think this is something that's interesting about being able to depict this in fiction, is that, especially depending on what perspective you end up using, whether it's, third person or whatever, that the way we remember things and the way that they actually happened and the way that we experience them in the moment, those might be three different things. There's something that I think about with memory. Somebody described this to me a few years ago, that when we remember something, we're not actually remembering the thing, we're remembering our last memory of it.
Yeah.
And how different that ends up being. That discrepancy, I feel like, between the experience and the memory is something that is really fascinating to me, and so indicative of how the experience of these things changes and what things end up meaning to us later in life as compared to what they meant to us in the moment. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I know you can really get disturbed by it if you let yourself linger on it for too long.
Yeah.
Nothing is how I really remember it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's great for fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think we're just about out of time, but there is a question that I like to end with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity that you've experienced in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah, I have a few recommendations. So I'll start with two books that are written in reverse chronological order that I really love, which are informing my work on this novel. The first is Charles Baxter's novel, First Light, which is about a pair of siblings, Hugh and Dorsey. And it begins in their middle age and then moves backward in time to the birth of Dorsey, who's the younger sibling, when Hugh is just a little boy. It's really moving and really intelligent, and I just love it. And the other one is The Long View by Elizabeth Jane Howard. I don't think she's very well known in the States. She was a British novelist, working in I want to say like the latter half of the 1900s, which makes it sound like a lot longer ago than it was, I guess. But when did she die? I'm not sure. She was Kingsley Amis's second wife and Martin Amis's stepmother. And she's written, her books are just they're wonderful. It's very funny and deep and super perceptive. And the way that she gets into her character's experience is incredibly facile and supple. Talk about like a third person narrative voice that can easily get into the perspectives of the characters. This one is very, very agile. And this book, The Long View, moves backward in time from 1950 to 1926. And it's a portrait of a marriage from the sort of 34 years into them knowing each other. Is that right? Did I just do the math wrong? 14 years? I can't do math. This married couple, Antonia and Conrad, so they're married and their daughter is pregnant and their son is getting married in the first chapter. And then by the last chapter, they're just meeting for the first time in 1926. And it moves backward through the World War, the Second World War. And it's just so intelligent about, the relationship between politics and the personal lives of these characters. A really broad and long view of a marriage, but also a whole family, complicated family and relationship. And there are affairs, and it's really wonderful. It's a great novel.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me back, Mike. It was so fun. Your questions are excellent.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to speak with you.
All right, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes for you to buy your own copy of Fruit of the Dead. There's also a link to Rachel's website where you can find not only information about herself and her books, but also links to many of her short fiction and nonfiction pieces, which I highly recommend. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back on August 28th with a conversation with Jennifer Baker about her debut YA novel, Forgive Me Not, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.